There's a loneliness that exists only in places the world has forgotten. In 24-hour laundromats, where machines hum through the night and no one speaks above a whisper. In highway rest stops, where strangers pass through but never stay. In the pre-dawn hours when the night is ending but the day hasn't quite begun, and the people keeping watch in those in-between spaces feel invisible to everyone except God. This is a story about one of those places and one of those people. 70-year-old woman who folded strangers' clothes in the middle of the night and discovered that God had been folding her broken life back together the entire time. This is not a story about someone who had everything figured out. This is a story about someone who was barely holding on, about a woman who knelt beside her bed every night and whispered prayers so desperate they felt more like survival than faith. But those prayers, they moved heaven, because God doesn't need our eloquence or our confidence. He just needs our honesty. He just needs us to show up broken and afraid and whisper, "Don't let me fall." And then he does what he's always done. He catches us. Sometimes in ways we never expected, sometimes through people we never saw coming, always exactly when we need him most. I have a powerful testimony to share with you today, but I need you to promise me something. If you stay until the end of this story, you will see how God works in mysterious ways. Subscribe now so you don't miss any testimony that could be the exact message your heart needs today. And tell me in the comments, which country are you watching from? And let me ask you, have you ever felt that God answered a prayer when you least expected it? I want to hear your story. Her name was Clara May Bennett. She was 70 years old, an American woman born and raised in Des Moines, Iowa, a place where the winters were harsh, the people were practical, and hard work was considered a virtue second only to faith. Clara had fair skin marked by time, by decades of sun and struggle etched into lines around her eyes and across her forehead. Her short grey hair was always neatly combed, even on her hardest days. Her hands were hardened by work, calloused, strong, the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime doing jobs other people didn't want to do. She worked the night shift at a small 24-hour laundromat near a nearly forgotten highway on the outskirts of Des Moines. It was the kind of place people stopped at out of necessity, not choice. Truck drivers needing to wash their clothes before the next long haul, night shift workers trying to get laundry done between jobs, travelers who had broken down nearby and needed somewhere to wait. The building was old, the machines temperamental, the fluorescent lights flickering with that persistent hum that never quite left your head. Every night from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Clara cleaned the machines, folded other people's abandoned clothes, collected coins from the washers and dryers, swept floors that never stayed clean, and offered cheap coffee from a pot she kept brewing in the small back office. She moved through the laundromat like a quiet ghost, present but unnoticed, essential but invisible. Almost no one knew her name. To the few regulars who came through, she was just the lady at the laundromat, a fixture, a part of the machinery, someone who had probably always been there and probably always would be. Clara had kind eyes, the kind that looked at you and really saw you, even when you were trying not to be seen. Eyes that carried both weariness and compassion in equal measure. She spoke softly, never intruding, but always offering a gentle, "Good evening" or "Stay warm out there" when people came and went. She didn't expect conversation. Most people didn't want it. They just wanted their clothes clean and their privacy maintained. And Clara gave them both without question. Her faith was quiet and constant. The kind built not in triumphant moments, but in the small, relentless practice of showing up every single day and choosing to believe God was still there, even when you couldn't feel him. Every night before bed, which for Clara was around 7 a.m., after her shift ended and she drove home in the early morning light, she would kneel beside her simple bed in her small trailer and pray the same prayer she'd been praying for months. "Lord, I don't ask for comfort. Just hold me up." It wasn't eloquent. It showed wasn't confident, but it was honest. And Clara had learned that honesty was the only thing God required. Clara hadn't always worked nights at a laundromat. 20 years ago, she'd been a cafeteria worker at a local elementary school, a job she'd loved because it let her see children every day, hear their laughter, watch them grow. She'd been married then too to a good man named Robert, who worked construction and came home every evening tired but smiling. They'd had 2 sons, raised them in a small house with a backyard, dreamed of retirement and grandchildren and growing old together. But Robert had died of a sudden heart attack 15 years ago, and everything changed. The house became too expensive to keep on one income. The boys grew up and moved away, Jason to Chicago, then later back to Iowa after things fell apart, Daniel to California, where he'd started his own family and rarely called. Clara downsized to a trailer, took the night shift at the laundromat because it paid slightly more than day shifts, and learned to live with a loneliness so deep it felt like a physical presence in her small home. The end of 2025 brought a series of blows that felt deliberately cruel, like the universe had looked at this quiet, faithful woman and decided to test exactly how much she could bear before breaking. In November, Clara received an eviction notice. The trailer park where she'd lived for over a decade had been sold to new owners who raised the rent by $200 a month. Clara was already 3 months behind on the old rent. She'd been using every spare dollar to help Jason, who was struggling financially and emotionally after losing his job. The notice was clear: pay what you owe plus the new rent or vacate within 30 days. Clara read that notice 3 times, sitting at her small kitchen table with her reading glasses slipping down her nose, and felt fear unlike anything she'd experienced in years. Real, visceral fear. She was 70 years old. Where would she go? What would she do? The thought of being homeless, of sleeping in her car or begging for space in a shelter made her feel sick with shame and terror. She folded the notice carefully, placed it in the drawer where she kept important papers, and tried to breathe through the panic. In early December came the second blow. Jason, her eldest son, showed up at her trailer with everything he owned packed into garbage bags in the back of his car. He'd lost his job at a warehouse after months of showing up late, calling in sick, not being able to focus. The anxiety and depression that had plagued him since his own divorce 2 years earlier had finally cost him the last stable thing in his life. "Mom," he'd said, standing on her doorstep looking decades older than his 42 years, "I have nowhere else to go." Clara had let him in without hesitation. Of course she had, but the weight of it pressed on her like a stone. She couldn't afford to feed herself, let alone her grown son. And Jason wasn't just broke, he was broken. He slept 16 hours a day, barely spoke, moved through the trailer like a ghost. He was on medication for anxiety, but it didn't seem to be helping. Clara watched him fade a little more each day and felt a guilt so crushing it made her chest ache. She had failed him somehow, failed to raise him strong enough, failed to protect him from the world. Failed. Then, a week before Christmas, came the third blow, and this one broke something in Clara that the others hadn't quite managed to reach. Her younger sister Linda, the only family Clara had left besides her sons, cut ties with her completely. It was over money, an old argument about their parents' inheritance that had festered for years. Linda had always believed she'd been cheated, that Clara had somehow manipulated their dying mother into leaving her more. It wasn't true. Clara had inherited a small life insurance policy and some furniture, nothing more. But Linda wouldn't hear it. The final conversation happened over the phone, Linda's voice cold and sharp. "I don't want to hear from you again, Clara. You're selfish. You've always been selfish. And I'm done pretending we're family." Then she hung up, and Clara sat holding the phone, staring at it like it might ring again, with an apology that never came. The loneliness that had always lived with her became something else entirely, a kind of isolation so complete it felt like being erased from the world. On New Year's Eve, That strange, hollow night when everyone else was celebrating and Clara was working, she stood alone in the laundromat at midnight and listened to distant fireworks echoing through the empty streets. The machines hummed their endless cycle. The fluorescent lights buzzed, and Clara felt the full weight of everything that had gone wrong pressing down on her until she could barely breathe. She went to the small back office, closed the door, and sat in the darkness with her hands folded in her lap. She thought about the eviction notice, about Jason sleeping on her couch, medicating himself into oblivion, about Linda's voice saying, "I'm done pretending we're family," about the fact that she was 70 years old and working nights at a laundromat to survive and still couldn't make rent, about how tired she was, how impossibly, soul-crushingly tired. Outside, the winter storm that had been threatening all evening finally arrived. Snow began to fall, not the gentle, pretty kind, but the harsh, wind-driven kind that turned the world white and hostile. Clara could hear it beating against the windows, could feel the temperature drop even inside the building. The storm outside matched the storm inside her, relentless, cold, threatening to bury everything. She thought about giving up, not dramatically. Clara wasn't a dramatic woman, but quietly, gently. Just stopping the fight to keep the trailer, stopping the effort to help Jason, stopping the pretense that faith made any difference when everything kept falling apart anyway. It would be so easy to just let go, to stop showing up, to disappear into the kind of invisibility that was permanent instead of just perceived. But then, almost against her will, Clara found herself praying. Not the neat, composed prayer she usually whispered, but something raw and desperate that came from a place so deep she didn't know it existed. "God," she said out loud to the empty office, "I don't understand what is happening. I don't understand why everything I touch falls apart. I don't understand why I'm still here, still fighting, still trying when nothing works. But please, please don't let me fall. I'm so close to falling, and I don't know if I can get back up if I do." She stayed there for a long time, maybe minutes, maybe an hour, letting the prayer hang in the air like breath on a cold night. And when she finally stood, wiped her eyes, and returned to the front of the laundromat, nothing had changed. The machines still hummed. The snow still fell. The loneliness still pressed in from all sides. But something in Clara had shifted. Not hope exactly, but a decision. A choice to keep going for one more day, one more shift, one more prayer, even when she couldn't see the point, even when faith felt like nothing more than stubbornness. That night, when her shift ended and she drove home through the snow, Clara stopped at the small kitchen table in her trailer before going to bed. She pulled out an old family photograph, one from before Robert died, when the boys were young and smiling and everything felt possible, and stared at it for a long time. Then she whispered into the quiet, "I don't know what you're doing, God, but I'm still here. I'm still showing up. Don't let that be for nothing." It was a few nights later, January 3rd, a Friday morning just before dawn, when Clara's life changed forever. She was wiping down the folding tables, preparing for the early morning rush that sometimes came when factory workers got off shift when the door opened and a man walked in. He was older, maybe Clara's age, maybe older, hard to tell, and he was shivering violently despite the heavy coat he wore that was held together with safety pins and hope. His name was Peter, though Clara didn't know that yet. What she knew was that he was homeless. That much was obvious from his appearance, from the worn backpack slung over his shoulder, from the way he moved into the warmth of the laundromat like someone who hadn't been warm in a very long time. His face was weathered and gaunt, his beard unkempt, his eyes carrying the kind of exhaustion that comes from sleeping outside in January in Iowa. He didn't approach the machines, didn't pretend he was there to do laundry. He just stood near the door, hands shoved in his pockets, trying to absorb as much warmth as he could before someone inevitably told him to leave. And sure enough, within minutes, one of the other customers, a middle-aged woman doing her family's laundry, looked up, saw Peter, and her expression hardened. She walked over to Clara with the kind of purposeful stride that meant trouble. "Excuse me," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Are you going to do something about that?" She nodded toward Peter. "I don't feel safe with him in here. He needs to leave." Another customer, a young man scrolling on his phone while waiting for his dryer to finish, looked up and nodded agreement. "Yeah, this is a business, not a homeless shelter." Clara felt something twist inside her chest. She looked at Peter, really looked at him, and saw not a threat, but a human being. Someone's father, maybe. Someone's son, certainly. Someone who had lived a whole life before whatever tragedy brought him to this moment. Someone who was cold and tired and just wanted a few minutes of warmth. Someone exactly like her, really, just at a different stage of falling. For a moment, Clara hesitated. She could ask him to leave. It would be easier. It would keep the other customers happy. It would avoid conflict. But then she thought about the prayer she'd whispered just nights before, "Don't let me fall," and realized that maybe, just maybe, God was giving her the chance to hold someone else up. Even when she barely had the strength to stand herself, Clara walked over to Peter slowly, gently, not wanting to startle him. He looked at her with eyes that expected rejection, had probably received it so many times he couldn't even feel it anymore. "Sir," Clara said softly, "would you like some coffee? I keep a pot brewing in the back." Peter blinked, confused. "I don't have money," he said, his voice rough from cold and disuse. Clara smiled. "I didn't ask if you had money. I asked if you'd like some coffee." She led him to the small seating area near the vending machines, just a couple of plastic chairs and a small table, and brought him a steaming cup of coffee and a clean towel from the supply closet. "You can warm up here as long as you need," she said quietly. "No one's going to bother you, I promise." Peter stared at her like she'd just performed a miracle. "Thank you," he whispered. "You don't know what this means." The other customers were not pleased. The woman who had complained earlier approached Clara again, her voice sharp. "You can't let him stay here. This is inappropriate. I'm going to call the owner." Clara met her gaze calmly. "You're welcome to do that, ma'am. But he's not bothering anyone. He's just, trying to get warm. And I'm not going to send anyone back out into that cold if I can help it." The woman huffed, gathered her laundry, and left in a cloud of self-righteous indignation. Clara sat down across from Peter and listened to his story. He had lost everything in a house fire 6 months earlier. His home, his belongings, his sense of safety. Insurance hadn't covered it all. He'd tried to rebuild but couldn't keep up with the costs. Lost his job when the stress became too much. Ended up on the streets, bouncing between shelters and parking lots, trying to survive one day at a time. "I used to be someone," he said quietly. "Used to have a life. Now I'm just this." Clara reached across the table and put her hand over his. "You're still someone," she said firmly. "You're a child of God, and He sees you. I see you, and you matter." Then she did something she rarely did with customers. She prayed, out loud, right there in the laundromat. A simple prayer asking God to protect Peter, to provide for him, to remind him he wasn't forgotten. When she finished, Peter was crying, silent tears streaming down his weathered face. He stayed until morning, sipping coffee, warming up, resting. When he finally left, he shook Clara's hand and said, "I won't forget this. I won't forget you." Clara watched him go, disappearing back into the cold January morning, and whispered a prayer that God would watch over him. Then she finished her shift, cleaned up, and went home, tired but somehow lighter than she'd felt in weeks. The next day, Clara's shift started like any other. She arrived at the laundromat at 10 p.m., started the coffee, checked the machines, swept the floor. But around midnight, her phone rang. It was the owner of the laundromat, a man named Mr. Henshaw, who rarely called and never this late. Clara's heart sank. The complaining customer must have called him. She was about to be fired for letting a homeless man stay, for showing compassion when she should have shown business sense. "Clara," Mr. Henshaw's voice came through the phone, steady but serious. I need to see you in my office tomorrow afternoon, 2 p.m. Can you make it? Clara's mouth went dry. Yes, sir, she said quietly. I'll be there. He hung up without another word. Clara stood holding the phone, feeling the ground shift beneath her feet. She was about to lose the only job she had, the only income keeping her from complete destitution, all because she'd given a homeless man a cup of coffee. She finished her shift in a daze, drove home in the pale pre-dawn light, sat at her kitchen table and stared at the eviction notice still sitting in the drawer. Jason was asleep on the couch, oblivious, and Clara felt the familiar weight of failure pressing down on her. God, she whispered, I tried to do the right thing. I tried to show your love, and now I'm going to lose everything. I don't understand. I really don't understand. The hours until the meeting felt endless. Clara barely slept. When 2 p.m. finally arrived, she drove to Mr. Henshaw's office with her hands shaking on the wheel, practicing what she would say to defend herself, trying to figure out how she would survive without this job. She walked into his office convinced she was about to be let go, convinced this was the final blow that would knock her down for good. But before the meeting even began, Clara's morning got worse. On her way to Mr. Henshaw's office, her car, old, unreliable, held together by prayers and used parts, started making a terrible grinding noise. The check engine light flickered on. Clara pulled over, called a mechanic, and got an estimate that made her want to cry. $800 minimum, money she absolutely did not have, money that might as well have been $8 million. She sat in the mechanic's parking lot with her head on the steering wheel and felt herself breaking. The car, the eviction, Jason, Linda, the job she was about to lose. It was all too much, too heavy, too impossible. She had tried so hard to keep going, to keep faith, to keep believing, and for what? Everything was still falling apart. I can't do this, she whispered into the empty car. I can't carry this anymore. I'm done. I'm just done. But she wasn't done. Because somehow, running on empty, held together by sheer stubborn faith, Clara made it to Mr. Henshaw's office. She walked in expecting termination and got herself ready to accept it with whatever dignity she had left. She sat down across from him, hands folded in her lap to hide their shaking, and waited for the axe to fall. Mr. Henshaw looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I watched the security footage from the other night. The homeless man, the way you treated him, the way you stood up to that customer who wanted him thrown out. Clara's heart sank. Here it comes, she thought. The lecture about liability and business image and appropriate boundaries. But Mr. Henshaw wasn't frowning. He was smiling. Clara, he said, quietly, I've owned that laundromat for 15 years, and in all that time I've never once seen an employee treat another human being with that kind of dignity, that kind of compassion. You didn't just give that man coffee, you gave him humanity. And that, he paused, that's exactly what this community needs. Clara stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. I don't understand, she whispered. Mr. Henshaw leaned forward. I'm creating a new position, laundromat manager and community coordinator. Better pay, $15 an hour instead of $12. A stable contract, benefits including health insurance, and your primary responsibility, beyond managing the night shift, will be to create a small solidarity space inside the laundromat for vulnerable people. Coffee, a warm place to sit, connection to social services, nothing huge, just what you've already been doing. But officially, Clara felt tears streaming down her face. Why? She managed to ask. Why would you do this? Mr. Henshaw smiled gently. Because I've been where that man was. 20 years ago, I lost everything to addiction, lived on the streets for 2 years, and the only reason I'm sitting in this office today is because someone showed me the same kindness you showed that man. Someone saw me when I was invisible, and it saved my life. He slid a contract across the desk. This is your offer. Take your time, think about it. But Clara, you're not in trouble. You're being promoted. Because what? You did? That's not a liability. That's exactly the kind of heart this world needs more of. Clara sat there, contract in her trembling hands, unable to speak. She had walked into this office expecting to lose everything, and instead, God had just opened a door she never knew existed. That same afternoon, still reeling, still crying, still unable to believe what had just happened, Clara got another call. This one from a local church whose pastor had partnered with Mr. Henshaw before. They wanted to help fund the Solidarity program. They had connections to a social shelter, to job placement services, to mental health resources. We've been looking for someone to coordinate outreach at accessible locations, the pastor said. And Mr. Henshaw says you're the person we need. Within a week, the program was taking shape. A small corner of the laundromat dedicated to helping people experiencing homelessness. Free coffee, clean clothes from donated items, a bulletin board with resources, and Clara, 70-year-old Clara, who had been about to be evicted, who had been one crisis away from homelessness herself, running it all. Peter, the man she'd helped, came back. He used the program. With support, he found a simple job at a nearby warehouse. Started saving money, began rebuilding. Every time he saw Clara, he hugged her and whispered, "Thank you. You saved my life." And Clara would whisper back, "No. God saved us both." The promotion changed Clara's life in tangible, immediate ways. The $15 an hour wasn't wealth, but it was enough to pay the back rent on her trailer and meet the new rate without panic, enough to fix her car, not perfectly, but enough to keep it running, enough to buy groceries without calculating every dollar, enough to finally breathe without the constant terror of financial collapse. The health insurance meant Clara could see a doctor for the first time in years, could get her blood pressure checked, her medications adjusted. The preventive care she'd been putting off because she couldn't afford it. It meant dignity. It meant being treated like a person whose health mattered. And after decades of being invisible, that alone felt like a miracle. But the greatest change wasn't financial. It was purpose. Clara had spent years folding other people's laundry in the middle of the night, feeling like her life didn't matter, like she was just filling space until she died. Now she was coordinating a program that actually helped people. She connected homeless individuals to shelters. She made calls to job placement services. She sat with people who were broken and told them what someone had told Peter: "You're still someone. You're a child of God, and you matter." Jason, her son, witnessed all of this. He watched his mother, who had been barely surviving herself, receive this unexpected blessing and immediately use it to help others. He saw her come home from shifts exhausted but fulfilled, tired but no longer, crushed, and something in him shifted. He went back to his doctor, got his medications adjusted, started therapy properly. He began applying for jobs again, stopped sleeping 16 hours a day, started looking his mother in the eye again and saying, "Thank you, I'm sorry, I'm trying." Their relationship, which had been strained to the breaking point by his depression and her inability to fix it, began to heal. They started eating dinner together at the small kitchen table, started talking, really talking, about Robert's death, about the divorce, about the years of pain they'd both been carrying alone. It wasn't perfect. Recovery never is, but it was real, and it was happening. By the end of January, Clara was no longer living under the threat of eviction. Her promotion gave her financial stability, not wealth, not security forever, but enough for right now. And for Clara, who had been praying just to survive, enough for right now felt like abundance. The Solidarity program continued to grow in quiet, steady ways. Peter wasn't the only person it helped. Others came, some referred by the shelter, some just wandering in from the cold and discovering this unexpected haven. Clara kept the coffee pot full, kept the donated clothes organized, kept the resource board updated. And she treated every single person who came through with the same dignity she'd shown Peter that first night. The local church became deeply involved, sending volunteers to help during peak hours, organizing, Clothing drives, fundraising for supplies. The pastor started holding small prayer services at the laundromat on Sunday evenings, informal gatherings where anyone was welcome, where homeless individuals sat beside church members and everyone was treated as equal before God. Clara led some of these gatherings, her quiet faith suddenly given a platform she never sought, but somehow fit perfectly. Other laundromats in the area started asking Mr. Henshaw how they could create similar programs. Local news ran a small story about the 70-year-old woman turning a laundromat into a lifeline. Clara hated the attention. She wasn't doing this for recognition, but she tolerated it because it brought more resources, more donations, more help for the people who needed it. Jason started volunteering at the laundromat on weekends. At first, Clara thought it was just to help her, but she soon realized it was helping him too. Being around people who were struggling gave him perspective on his own pain. Being useful, truly useful, helping others in concrete ways gave him purpose he'd been missing. He and Clara would work side by side, folding donated clothes, making coffee, listening to stories, and their relationship deepened in ways it hadn't since he was a child. Clara's trailer, the one she'd almost lost, became a gathering place. She started hosting small dinners for people from the program who were transitioning off the streets, giving them a home-cooked meal and a place where they were treated like family. Peter came often, others too. Jason would help cook and they'd all sit around the small table, this collection of broken people who had found each other in the unlikeliest place, and share food and stories and hope. On a quiet evening in late February, Clara sat on the modest porch of her trailer at sunset. The Iowa winter was beginning to soften, the first hints of spring in the air, the days getting longer, the impossible cold finally releasing its grip. She held her old Bible in her lap, the one Robert had given her 40 years ago, its pages soft from being read and reread through every season of her life. She thought about everything that had happened. The eviction notice she'd almost not survived, the terror of losing everything, the night she'd stood in the laundromat and prayed, "Don't let me fall," and then Peter walking through the door, this homeless stranger who had somehow become the instrument of her salvation. She thought about how close she'd come to giving up, how close she'd come to believing God had forgotten her. "I asked to survive," she whispered into the twilight, her voice soft but steady. "And you gave me purpose. I asked you not to let me fall. And you didn't just catch me. You lifted me up and gave me work to do. Work that matters, work that helps people, work that makes my life mean something." Tears streamed down her weathered face, but they were good tears, grateful tears, the tears of someone who had walked through the valley and come out the other side not unscathed, but transformed. Clara May Bennett's story didn't end with wealth or fame. She still worked nights at the laundromat, still cleaned machines, still folded clothes, still swept floors. But she was no longer invisible. She was seen by the people she helped, by the community she served, by the God who had been watching her all along. Her small acts of kindness had grown into something bigger than she could have imagined. And every person who walked through those laundromat doors left different. Not because Clara was extraordinary, but because she had learned to offer what little she had and trust God to multiply it. This is the truth. Clara's life taught the world. God sees those the world ignores. God acts when everything seems lost. God transforms humiliation into dignity. And sometimes the greatest miracle is not changing everything around us, but renewing our faith within, showing us that our prayers haven't been ignored, that our struggles haven't been meaningless, that even at 70, even when you're barely holding on, God can use you in powerful ways if you're willing to show up and offer whatever you have, even if all you have is a cup of coffee and a kind word, and the stubborn, desperate faith that refuses to believe you've been forgotten. If you made it this far, it was not by chance. God placed this story in front of you because you needed to hear it. Now I want you to do something for me. Subscribe to the channel so you can keep receiving these stories that feed the soul. And in the comments, tell me which country you are from and share this with me. What did this testimony leave in your heart? Is there something in your life you need to surrender to God today? Share your prayer, your pain, or your joy. Here, we are a family, and your story matters.